thank you all for being here. So first, a bit about me, so that you know where I'm coming from in relationship to this topic. So there are three main areas to my research. First, I'm a historian of film technology. So in my work, I investigate how the cinema both consists of and relies on a variety of machines, systems, chemical processes, and so forth. So whether we're talking about the light sources in a film projector, or the chemistry of film emulsion, or the architecture of movie theaters, I'm always mindful of how the technical properties of the film apparatus are integral to the way artists use the medium, and also how audiences experience movies. Now, my second big research interest is in film culture. So not just the films themselves, but the social and cultural dynamics surrounding the cinema. So the when and how and why people go to the movies, what role the medium plays in their lives and in the lives of their communities. And then finally, I also do research on film genres, because I'm very interested in how conventions of storytelling become established. And I'm also interested in the stories that we like to repeat. So I think that while film genres, on the one hand, are predictable, which is how you know they're in a particular genre, they can, within those structures, provide filmmakers with very interesting opportunities for creativity. And we will explore some of that later in my talk. So, as you'll see in my lecture this evening, I'm going to think about the rhetoric of film in relationship to the First World War through these three frameworks of technology, film culture, and genre. So when we look at the First World War from a media history point of view, it becomes clear that this was the first extensively mediated war. Now, of course, people had used photographic equipment in military contexts since photography was invented in the 19th century. You've all seen Civil War photographs, obviously. But World War I was filmed and photographed more extensively than any previous conflict. And photographic technologies had crucial tactical roles. And furthermore, the countries involved in the war began to make concerted efforts to exploit the propaganda possibilities of the motion picture. So in my talk, I'm going to explore the idea of World War I as a mediated conflict in three ways. So first, I'll talk a bit about the documentation of the war on film and the reception of those films on the home front, and raise some questions about the propagandistic qualities of those films. I'll also talk about it in terms of how film and military technologies developed not just simultaneously, but in an interconnected manner, and how rapidly changing media technologies played a role in military tactics. And then third, I'll bring this discussion into the present day and talk about efforts to preserve and restore World War I material and some contemporary uses of archival material in recent commemorative projects marking the centenary of the war. So, as I mentioned, World War I was the first conflict to be extensively filmed. Cinematographers would film training exercises, demonstrations of military equipment, and also travel to the front lines to film combat and its aftermath. Much of this material would be exhibited as newsreels, and then also as propaganda films. And often the boundary between newsreel and propaganda was unclear. So in order to understand the implications of this, we need to understand some things about the film culture that was in place at the start of the war. So what did going to the movies look like in 1914? So this photograph is from the New Zealand Film Archive, and this is a fairly lavish cinema, right? But it shows a movie theater in the period of the war. So by 1914, all of the countries involved in the war had an established cinema infrastructure. Films had been in use for about 20 years at this point, but at least for the first decade, unless you lived in a major city, your experience of film might have been quite limited, possibly to visits from itinerant film exhibitors, people who traveled from town to town with filmmaking and projection equipment, and then they would put on a show for a few days. By 1914, there were a lot more dedicated spaces for film viewing. And it was relatively easy, or easier, to access projection technology. Also, there were established commercial networks for distributing films. All of this is important because it's one thing for us to watch a film from 100 years ago and ask ourselves, what it teaches us about history. But if we're going to understand what that film meant to people at the time it was created and the people it was created for, we have to ask if and how they were able to see it. So it's all very well to say, well, we invented cinema, but its proliferation and its cultural impact depend on there being an industrial and commercial infrastructure for it. So as I said, this is a cinema in New Zealand. There are lots of photographs of movie theaters I could have shown you. But I chose this one in part to make it clear that while much of the film material I'm going to talk about is British, French, or American, the viewership for this material and the range of its reach was truly global. Now, of course, New Zealanders fought in the war, and so audiences there would be very invested in its outcome. But the point is that this kind of material was screened everywhere. So, in 1914, there was cinema infrastructure, but then also newsreel footage of the war played a significant role in increasing cinema attendance. So movies had been a popular form of entertainment, but during the war, a lot of people who had not been avid film goers started to attend more regularly, in large part to see newsreels because they were hungry for information. So during the war, as many as 10 million people in Britain were going to the cinema at least once a week. And at that time, the population of Britain, including Ireland, was 46 million. So 10 million is a big chunk of the population. And that doubled or even tripled pre-war attendance figures. So what kind of material were these audiences watching? Well, there's a proliferation of newsreels. Now, it's fair to say that before the war, newsreel material presented less what we might describe as news and more what was termed actualities. So nonfiction footage that was visually interesting. Also, I should note that by the start of the war, newsreels were still a fairly recent phenomenon. So companies producing newsreels were started to be established in Europe around 1908. So it was still a relatively new form by the time the war began. So the war gave newsreels a particularly captivating subject. Not only was the material exciting, poignant, fearsome, but of course it tapped into some important elements of the pre-existing film culture. So let's consider this poster for a film from 1916, Fighting Around Verdun. The first thing I want to say is there's a very common perception when we talk about historical film audiences, this idea that they were naive spectators, right? A classic story is that in early cinemas, there'd be a movie of a train coming and everybody in the audience would scream and run away because they thought the train was going to come out of the wall. People didn't think the train was coming out of the wall. But there was a popular story and one that we're still telling. People's relationships to media were always more complicated than that. So even today, we simultaneously believe and are skeptical of the media images that were shown, and people have always been like that. Having said that, if you look at popular commentary about film in this period, and nonfiction film, writers would remark on how films appeared to record reality impassively. Whereas in print media, so newspapers, that required the intermediary of the reporters and editors. Now, I want to assure you that then, as now, that the notion that film gives you a direct, somehow pure access to reality or lacks editorializing is not true. But you'll notice the words on this poster: authentic, official, exclusive, each suggesting that there's something about these images that will take you closer to the action, that will provide you with, well, an authentic experience, and will give you an enhanced understanding of what's going on in the conflict that is distinct from other media. It promises 6,000 feet of real action. At this time, they would advertise the duration of a film in feet rather than in hours and minutes, because, well, it all depended on the projectionist and how fast they were cranking. On average, they're advertising a movie a little over an hour long here, but again, it depends. So part of the appeal for audiences of watching war footage was not only the hope of a better understanding of the ongoing conflict, but also something more personal, in that very often in their explanations of why people were going to see these films is they wanted to see people they knew, family members, people from their communities. Obviously, when your loved ones are at war, you worry about them. And the films were promoted as providing a kind of direct access to the people at the front. Now, I should note that this idea of a personal connection offered through film had a very important precedent in film culture of that period. Let me offer you an example from the British context. So, as I mentioned, by 1914, there was this established film exhibition infrastructure. Excuse me. In the first decade or so of cinema in Britain, outside major cities, most of the time, if you saw movies, it was a traveling cinematographer would come to town, and not only would they show movies, but they would film things in your town. They would often time their journeys through the country according to when there would be festivals or parades or other big events in the communities they were going to visit. And so they would come into a town, film the Easter parade or what have you, develop the movie, and then the next day sell tickets to a show where not only could you see films from exotic locations, but you could see film of your own town and of your own neighbors and maybe of yourself. So it's important to understand that for audiences in this period, there was this precedent for going to the movies to see not just other things that you couldn't see otherwise, but things that were literally close to home. One of these companies called Mitchell and Kenyon, their slogan was "Local films for local people." And again, companies like that started operating at the end of the 19th century up until shortly before the war. So this is a good example of how film culture shaped audiences' expectations for film as a medium, and also how the people producing newsreels and propaganda quickly realized that they could capitalize on those norms, those expectations. Come see the films that not only make a vast, confusing, terrifying conflict seem more comprehensible, but also watch them with some of the same sensibility of connecting with your local community. So there was a kind of intimacy to the film-going experience for many British audiences that I would argue carried over into the why and how they viewed footage from the war. So where did all this footage come from? I'm going to introduce you to the Moy and Basty 35mm film camera. This is in the, there we go, collection of the Imperial War Museum. This was typical of the kind of camera equipment that was used to shoot newsreels in this period. And a few things to know about this. So this was about 18 inches high. It would have been hand cranked And also, there was no viewfinder. So to set up a shot, the cinematographer would have to open a little panel in the back of the camera and look through the lens, figure out the focus, figure out the framing, and then close it all up and start shooting. If they had that open, it would just expose all the film if they left it open while rolling. I mention this to give you both a sense of the professional skill of the cinematographers, things they would have had to take into account, particularly if they were going to move the camera, in which case focus might shift or things like that. But also to impress upon you that setting up a shot was a lot more complicated than what you're familiar with the camera on your phone. Okay? So it took a lot of thinking, a lot of planning to decide what you were going to shoot. Now, another thing about this type of camera, here's just again for scale, so when using it, you needed a lot of light in order to get an exposure. So you would really need to be shooting in ample sunlight. Shooting in low light conditions would be extremely difficult, and that placed limits on what you could shoot and when. Further, the camera, the tripod, and film canisters altogether weighed about 80 pounds. So there were many practical challenges to moving this equipment around, particularly on a battlefield. Just to see someone struggling to move this through a trench. There were other restrictions or factors that filmmakers would have to deal with that had to do with political and regulatory factors, determining who could film what and where. So each country quickly figured out that film cameras at the front, or otherwise within military institutions, needed some form of regulation. There was a fear that, of course, either deliberately or inadvertently, intelligence would get out, right? A film that details how your cannon works could be quite useful to your enemy. There was also a growing awareness of how images of the war could influence public opinion. Now, when I say that there was a rapid realization of this, at the very beginning of the war, most people thought that the war wouldn't last very long. So there wasn't too much concern about creating propaganda to maintain enthusiasm, right, for the war effort in various populations. But as it started to wear on, they realized, oh, we really need to manage public opinion about this. So the relationships among newsreel companies, government and military officials, and then also military film units evolved quickly. And all of those parties involved were grappling with the implications of being able to document a modern war in a modern way. So, as I mentioned before, governments established propaganda offices. So in Britain, the War Propaganda Bureau was established in 1914, and its first production, which was called Britain Prepared, was released in late 1915. Now, of course, the idea of influencing people's point of view through media was not a new phenomenon, but one that, or I should say one of the transformations that came with the war was that governments started to focus on the strategic use of film in shaping public attitudes. And this would lay the groundwork for the extraordinarily powerful propaganda of the Second World War. So you set up all these offices for propaganda, and then those offices stay in place, and they think about what to do next. Okay. That brings me to the Battle of the Somme. So this is a feature-length propaganda film, and I'm going to move to another window. There we go. Feature-length propaganda film produced by the British, and it was released in 1916. So a bit of context about...
How long did the battle last? I don't remember.
From July to November. in 1916.
So there was a lot of editing that took place.
Yes, and the films, well, it's interesting. The British, the French, and the Germans all made films about this battle. And if you watch them all, you have very different accounts of what happened, and even who won. So, for context, the Battle of the Somme was among the bloodiest battles in history. As I said, went from July to November, so took a long time, and is named after the river Somme in France. 1 million people were either killed or injured in the battle, and 3 million soldiers took part. So this was an event that had vast impact, both in the war itself, but also in the society more broadly. And several things are remarkable about this film. Many people went to see it, including populations that didn't normally go to movies. And many viewed it multiple times, specifically because they hoped to see people they knew. So as I mentioned, right, that was already part of the film culture. And in this film, and we'll look at an example in a minute, they made a point of getting a lot of shots of soldiers' faces and encouraging a kind of identification with those soldiers on the part of the viewer. So the film worked, right? Kept people coming back hoping to see someone they would recognize. Now, I'm going to show you a little bit of the beginning of part 3. And I should point out this is a restoration of this film undertaken by the Imperial War Museum, and you can watch it on their website. So, in the first part, you'll see an intertitle and then footage of men in a trench and then going over the top. And then you'll see them struggling through some barbed wire and disappearing into the fog. Okay. And I want you to make note of the men who fall. Okay. We'll continue in a second. Those two shots are very carefully framed. They show you just the right amount of information. And I find the second one, where you see the last man disappear into the smoke and then the shot ends, particularly poetic. These shots are reenactments, or at least they were staged for the camera. So you could describe them as reenactments or dramatizations. And indeed, a lot of footage from the front, particularly footage that purports to show combat, was staged. Now, there are lengthy debates among film historians about exactly how much of the footage was or wasn't staged, and also what it means to stage something. But given the complexities of setting up a shot, getting equipment into position, and also getting the ideal lighting conditions, one would get more effective images, arguably more realistic images, if you could control some of those factors. Furthermore, if you think about this on a tactical level, the generals aren't going to hold off on the attack until the camera operators are ready and the light is coming from the right angle. That's not how it's going to happen. Okay, so you might think, well, that's outrageous, right? You're faking footage. You're making things up. Well, one thing is that in terms of audience expectations about actualities, right, real material, there was lots of precedent in newsreels for reenactments. So for example, during the Boer War. There was some actual footage of the Boer War, but not very much. But audiences were used to getting Boer War updates in the form of reenactments of battles. And so that was really understood at the time as something that you could expect when it came to war imagery. And we'll talk a bit more about the implications of staging in a bit. This film also cultivates kind of poignancy by calling attention to the things it does not show. So I'm going to continue, and we'll have several extended shots of soldiers in a sunken road in no man's land. And I want you to note what the intertitle says about these men. And it comes after this shot of the field, where you can see figures running around in the distance. I think there's a small explosion coming too. Okay. So, we're introduced to these men, and we have these extended shots of their faces, and we have this intertitle of foreboding, right? It says that they're from Lancashire, and that also 20 minutes after we took this footage, they were subjected to heavy machine gun fire. This is what I mean by the film drawing attention to the things that you are not seeing, but that you're left to imagine. Of course, the implication is that for at least some of these men, this may be their last moments. This kind of arrangement of material, the way they edited things, the way they made use of these intertitles, was one of the reasons this film was so compelling for audiences at the time. It encouraged this affinity with, identification with the figure of the soldier, while also encouraging this sense of, well, admiration, right, for the sacrifice they might be about to make. And furthermore, this film was very effective in encouraging more people to head to the front. So they felt a kind of kinship with these figures. It's also notable how the men in this footage are looking at the camera, right? They're extremely aware that they are being filmed. So between that awareness on the part of the subjects and the reenactments, one has to consider that people in this kinds of footage, nonfiction footage, were very much performing for the camera and making choices about the kinds of things they wanted to communicate, what they wanted people back home to see. So those decisions were being made, of course, at the level of state and military strategy, but also on the part of the individuals appearing in the films. Now, there are moments in these films, instances where people being filmed might not be aware of the presence of the camera or thinking about it because they have other things on their mind. But it's important to understand that even while the discourse around the newsreel was one of offering authentic, direct address, these images were highly constructed and involved multiple decision-making processes. And those decisions include moral and ethical ones about what to photograph. How graphic should material be? I'll offer you an especially vivid example from the film scholar Rebecca Harrison, who has done research on films about ambulance trains. Let's go back here. So, she describes how the material from ambulance trains that was exhibited to the public tended to downplay the severity of soldiers' injuries and to sanitize popular understandings of the kind of medical care that they would need. When I say sanitize, and I mean that quite literally. So I mentioned very briefly at the beginning of my talk that one of the things I think about in relationship to film technology is chemistry. The types of film stock that they were using in this period, it was black and white film, but a tricky thing about black and white is that it reads colors, and not in ways that you might expect. It's surprisingly difficult to guess what color things are in a black and white image without knowing what kind of emulsion they were using and the kind of color sensitivity it had. So a consciousness of how color would be communicated in a black and white film, as well as careful control of the exposure of a film, could make things look brilliantly white that weren't. Make things look clean and comforting when in real life they were not, and could downplay the presence of things like blood, dirt, and so forth that might have appeared alarming in their true colors. So, my purpose in pointing out these ways that World War I seemingly real footage plays with, manipulates reality, is not to suggest that they lack value as historical documents. On the contrary, those manipulations point to the ways that this was indeed a mediated war. And when we become aware of those things, it can complicate how we visualize history. Now, in addition to the important role of film in documenting and cultivating ideas about the war, film as a technology was also an important tactical tool, which brings me to another way of thinking about World War I as mediated. So let me introduce the Akley Camera. This was originally developed for nature photography. And to prepare for nature photography, they prioritized things like making it good for shooting at low light conditions. It had a viewfinder mechanism, unlike the earlier camera, that allowed you to see what you were filming as you were shooting. The round shape, you'll notice here, made it much easier to tilt up and down, so you could move the camera in multiple directions simultaneously to, say, follow an animal. And it also contained a gyroscope stabilizer, so you could more easily operate it while moving and use it without a tripod. I'm going to quote from an article in Scientific American about this camera. This article is from March 1918. Mr. Akley, the inventor, realized that the requirements of the big game photographer were much the same as the war photographer. So he at once came to Washington and placed his invention at the disposal of the newly created photographic division of the USA Signal Corps. Major Barnes, chief of the division, was quick to see the possibilities of this revolutionary camera and adopted it as the box for our official war photographers. Since his camera had been taken over by the government, Mr. Akley has added several features which it is not possible to speak of here. Suffice it to state, however, that in this camera, the Signal Corps has beyond a doubt the most highly perfected motion picture camera extant. So we have this narrative of innovation tied to the war. The camera contributes to the war effort, and then that camera is in turn transformed by the needs of the war to better serve military ends, and thus becomes a better camera for all purposes. In this image, which is part of the same article, You'll note this caption that it is in use to film the spectacular flight of an airman. Now, those of you who may have attended the screening of Wings on Tuesday heard me talk about the significance of aviation and the figure of the aviator in images of war. And it's notable that this illustration makes note of aviation. In principle, they could have been filming anything up above, but they point out the spectacular flight of the airman. Advancements in aerial photography and cinematography would indeed become highly significant in military strategy. Now, early in the war, there was some skepticism about the use of aerial reconnaissance. So people in the military were familiar with thinking about the battlefield in, well, lateral terms. And the idea of seeing things from above had necessarily made you transform how you thought about the entire process, right? How a battle was going to work. So in Adrian Smith and Michael Hammond's introduction to a special issue of the Historical Journal of Film, Radio, and Television, which is devoted to the First World War, they explain how the rapid technological developments of the war in both military and cinematic equipment would support one another, like logistically, but they also would showcase one another. So quoting their essay, they say, "When we view footage from 1918 of an SE-58 in flight, we marvel at the evolution of such an efficient killing machine in 4 years, and at the equipment employed to provide such a clearly defined, sharply focused set of aerial images." Now, it's a truism that war is a big motivator for technological change. And Smith and Hammond's point is that not only was film one of the technologies that changed dramatically during the war, but that film had a close relationship, and even a symbiotic relationship, with other military technologies. For example, Captain Cooper from the aforementioned US Signal Corps, this is a camera that, again, was designed with a special turret so that you could go in any direction, to photograph the front from the air, and thus provide, again, an unprecedented literal perspective on what was going on the other side, allowing people to strategize in a whole different way. Now, I'm going to shift to the third part of my talk and discuss how issues of history, memory, and acts of commemoration make use of or connect with World War I footage. So first, writing the history of film in this war is complicated by the fact that only a fraction of the films from that period still exist. This is true of film generally. Any film made before the 1950s was on nitrate stock, which was extremely flammable, and therefore not only vulnerable to fire, but it also meant that libraries and archives wanted to get rid of it as soon as possible so that it didn't burn down the rest of their collection. So for decades, people actively got rid of nitrate prints because they didn't want the liability. Further, newsreel companies rarely preserve their materials. So scholars who study newsreels will tell you heartbreaking tales of how the companies would sell off their material to stock footage companies, and once they had worn out the material, they would just throw it away. In recent years, there have been shifts in attitudes about the cultural and historical value of old films. And indeed, film has this integral role in public memory of the 20th century. So our sense of history, of collective memory, is heavily shaped by mass media. With that in mind, it's fascinating to see how artists, historians, museums, and other institutions have made use of Great War era media in their commemorative projects in the past 4 years, marking the war's centenary. In the past decade, thanks to an array of digital technologies, our access to, and therefore relationship with, archival material has transformed. To give you an example, one of the classes I teach is on nonfiction media and war and military culture. And I always explain to my students that this is a course that I could not have taught 10 years ago, because I make such extensive use of online digitized archival material. And an interesting thing about those kinds of archives is that they include not only fictional or dramatized movies, but other types of film that have traditionally been neglected and left out of chronologies of film. So we tend to think about film history in terms of feature films. But of course, in people's real life experience of motion pictures, that would have included lots of other genres like newsreels, but also educational films, advertising, home movies, and so forth. And when those types of films become accessible, we can have a more holistic understanding of film history. So the clip I showed you from Battle of the Somme is from one of these restoration and digitization projects, as I mentioned, undertaken by the Imperial War Museum. Now, it's great, people are able to see old films, which changes your sense of history. But what's fascinating is to look at some of the ways that people have employed that material, so what they're doing with it. I'm going to offer you a couple of examples. So first, this is a clip from a short documentary about, well, this woman is a forensic lip reader. Most of her work is doing things like looking at security camera footage to figure out what people are saying when they're up to no good. But in this case, she is doing lip reading for an excerpt from Battle of the Somme. And I'm going to show you a little bit of her lip reading process. There we go.
Get them up a bit.
Get them up a bit. Oh, because he's...
I think he's talking to the bhakti.
Yes, he is, isn't he?
He wants the bhakti up.
Yeah, because he's got the crowbar, hasn't he, to get the lids off.
He's, get them up a bit. Come on then. Check them.
Well, they are, I mean, that's, they're checking
what they're doing.
They are, aren't they? That's good. The thing is that these men, they've been dead for years, these people, and we've got him actually speaking. Shall we move on then? The next one is a bit further in. 2 seconds. Here, these. In the back. No, the fat man and the short man.
You go, you go. You go.
Good.
You. And then he said to him, yes, that's it, cut them all. He said, that one's a man beside him. And then for the people in front, he said, go on, go on.
Fantastic. Okay, and then that one, go on, yes. So we've got, that's great. And then the next one then is this one.
Get them.
Get them.
He's and then we'll go.
Could it be fix then? F-I-X.
Fix them, yeah, fix. So I've got that down as alternative.
Fix
and then he says
Yeah.
to him, the second later, as he turned around, and then we'll go.
And then we'll go. That's incredible. Let's try this one at 26:20.
Jesus, 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 Jesus.
Yes.
Swear.
Okay. I should point out later in this video, she notes that she can tell that a person is speaking in a distinctive way, that he has a particular accent, and the man she's working with confirms that he's a Lancashireman. So she can detect elements of very specific verbal qualities, right, from this forensic lip reading. Now, there's several ways of thinking about this. So if you treat this film as a historical document, then forensic lip reading, like determining what people are saying, in effect extracts additional historical information from the film. Information that may not have been part of the original intended use. Now, another perspective on this is that the people viewing the film at the time, in 1916, particularly if they were people who went to a lot of movies, might be good lip readers themselves. And so we might just be detecting things about the film that original audiences would have been aware of. Now, another thing about this is that I'm not certain if it's this particular instance of lip reading, but forensic lip reading has been used to add dialogue to these films. There's a recent project by Peter Jackson where he's overseen the addition of sound, including dialogue, based on lip reading, as well as colorization of World War I footage to make it more accessible to today's viewers. Some have argued that by doing this, you're compromising the film as a historical document, so introducing things that weren't already there. I have some respect for that argument. On the other hand, there's another way of thinking of that in terms of, as I mentioned, how audiences at the time might have actually inferred things about color, about what people were saying from watching the original film. And I'm happy to entertain questions about that. The next example I'm going to look at is more fanciful. This is an excerpt from a television production from 2013 called The Great Martian War. What you're going to see is newsreel footage and also some footage that these filmmakers shot. See if you can tell the difference. And it will include some digital animation that reimagines the First World War as a science fiction narrative based on the story, The War of the Worlds, and its Martian invaders. So you see the tripods looming in the back. So this is an excerpt from a television movie.
Those are puppets?
They're digital animation. Yeah, so computer-generated images. Okay. Now, when I show you this science fiction reimagining of this footage, you might think, well, that was fun, but what does that have to do with history? There were no Martians at the front. Or you might find it kind of exploitative, right? The First World War was serious business. This footage shows dire events. Why are you inserting alien tripods walking around? Well, World War I filmmaking, whether of the battlefield, of the destruction done to cities and civilians, or the advancements in and implications of aerial cinematography, both the implications of seeing from above and the unique kind of mobility of cameras afforded by airplanes, became an important part of how 20th century people imagined and conceptualized of disaster. So after Tuesday's screening of Wings, a number of people remarked on how they could recognize so many elements of that movie in subsequent films, even in very recent ones. So the way that the war was visualized, conceptualized, edited together into certain types of narratives or genres is something that persists even today, that logic of how we think about war. So, when an artist, like these ones, combine science fiction imagery with World War I footage, they draw upon not only this recently accessible archival material, but also a whole century of war narratives. And in a way, demonstrate how important World War I imagery is in that history. Now, of course, the War of the Worlds, probably its most famous 20th century adaptation, was the infamous radio play, where Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater adapted War of the Worlds and performed it in the format of a news broadcast. Now, by the way, stories of mass hysteria and accompanying the broadcast were greatly exaggerated, often by newspapers who were trying to compete with radio news. But it did get people talking about the power of media, and it spoke to growing anxieties about the political stability of the world. That broadcast was before the Second World War started, but there were suggestions of what was coming. Subsequent adaptations of War of the Worlds connected the story with Cold War anxieties in the 1950s, the War on Terror in the early 21st century. This is a story that we retell again and again and use to revisit the worries of the day. So in this video, as one of many commemoration projects, not only does it make use of archival material and perhaps reach new audiences with it, but it also encourages us to think about the ways we look at this footage after a century. The experience of war can never be fully represented, of course, but we can ask ourselves what conventions have shaped what we see, and how images of both real and imagined wars influence and mirror one another. So I see in this an opportunity to contemplate how the continual interactions of technologies, of genres, from the camera operator in a trench at the Somme to the contemporary act of viewing his footage over the internet shape our memories, both personal and public. Thank you.